January the 12th, starting at 7:02 p.m. I, along with the office coordinator and the CFO are in chambers, and we have all of council, the CAO, and a couple of guests online, along with the council members. So I am putting forward a motion to call to order. We have a motion to adopt the agenda as is. Can I do that? Thank you. Second, good. Any changes, amendments? Peter, you're first. Nothing? Good, thank you. I have no changes. Anybody else? Any changes, additions? Nope, going. Thank you. All in favor of the agenda as is? Ayes, nays opposed? Thank you. Good. Corey, let's dance.
All right. Should we actually dance or just joking? Thanks everyone for having me here today. So my name's Corey. I am the CEO at Your City. And today I'm super excited to talk to you guys about asset management investment plan. So I'll go through the presentation. If you have any questions, just let me know. More than happy to elaborate. And let's keep this open and free flow and discussion. I'm going to just pull up my slides. First of all, can everyone hear me okay?
You're all good to go.
All good to go. Perfect. Can you guys see the presentation okay?
You're good.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to switch screens here. You're probably looking at the presenter view. Now, how about that? Are you guys looking at the big screen?
Big screen.
Big screen. Epic. Awesome. Yes. Thanks so much for having me here today. So just wanted to talk a little bit about asset management, subject near and dear to my heart. And really this project, at the end of the day, the goal of the project was help you guys refine your funding target down to a more realistic level that's grounded based in risk and level service. So if you might recall kind of previously, you guys did some work and you identified a life cycle funding target, and there was a pretty large funding gap. And that's a pretty common story with a lot of communities. So this project was really like, let's look at the data, let's look at your asset service lives, let's refine them. And with the goal of kind of refining the funding target to a more realistic level and to ground it based in risk and level service. So that was really the goal of the project. So I'll just go to the next one. That's essentially what we talked about. The core outcomes here, hoping to just build some awareness around asset management, the outcomes of the project, etc. Hoping to kind of gain some understanding around risk and level service and how we can use that to measure the performance of assets, gain some clarity on your financial future, and also gain some more confidence for you guys. So just wanted, before we get into it, just kind of bring up some of the challenges I would say with kind of asset management and say traditional approaches that I've come across. Just kind of want to highlight these so you guys are aware. So the number one challenge that I've seen kind of working with other communities in the past is the unrealistic funding target. So everyone kind of starts with this life cycle funding approach, which I think is often very conservative on lifespans. And it sets this funding target that is really unattainable for a lot of communities. So that's a big challenge. Another challenge is a lot of these asset management plans don't get integrated into a financial strategy, so they remain unfunded, which is obviously a challenge. The other challenge is it's difficult to show the trade-offs between risk, level service, and cost. It costs communities hundreds of thousands of dollars to do it, data, exercises, etc., which is very expensive, especially for smaller communities like Lions Bay. And it's very difficult also to show the impact decisions today have on your future, say 20, 30 years down the line, which makes it difficult for people to have confidence in decisions. So those are some of the common challenges that I've bumped up against working with other communities. And the cool thing here, we've been able to eliminate these challenges with kind of this new framework, new approach to asset management, which I'll share with you guys today. So the 4 steps we kind of took your community through was step number 1, we compiled your existing data. We also looked at it from a service life perspective. So we worked with Public Works. We adjusted service lives based on local understanding of assets to kind of calibrate the model, if you will. Step number 2, we calculated funding demand. So we looked at when are assets going to come up to the end of their life and what does that profile look like? Is there a large amount of expenditure short-term, medium-term, long-term? So we'll share with that. And then we looked at risk and level service. So we looked at different ways to measure risk and level service, different metrics. How do you want risk and level service to change based on asset category? And then finally, we presented and we'll present a few scenarios on different funding targets for asset replacement based on those risk and level of service scenarios that we developed. So that's kind of at a high level what we'll take you through today. Just some important assumptions before we get into it. This is kind of the boring stuff, if you will, but just keep in mind what we're talking about today is like for like replacement only. So we're not talking about level of service increases, meaning, we're replacing a, say, 4-meter wide road with a 4-meter wide road. You're not expanding it. You're replacing a 200 millimeter pipe with a 200 millimeter pipe. So this is like for like replacement, no capacity increases, no level of service increases. We're not accounting for, going green on buildings or anything like that. So important thing to note. It's also done in constant dollar analysis, which means it's in today's dollars. So when you think about these results, you got to account for inflation, which I think is best done really on the financial planning side. And the assets that were included in the study were sewer, water, roads, bridges, buildings, equipment, and drainage. So get that off the table there. So let's talk about step number 1. So compiling data. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but really what we did is we identified and compiled the existing data. The data at the end of the day, it informs the plan. So the better the data, the more confidence we can have in the plan. So we compiled the existing data. The main thing we focused on this kind of exercise is working with Public Works to really enhance the service lives. Before, they're using industry best practice, which we knew were kind of conservative, generic, etc. So we worked with them to really hone in those service lives, and they're definitely better. And there's always room for improvement. So over time, as you guys learn more, this asset lasts this long or this one lasts this long, you can continue to improve the model and just get more confidence in the results. But today, I think the service lives have been really adjusted greatly. And you've been able to, in essence, kind of do a high level condition assessment of your community simply by leveraging the knowledge of Public Works. So I really want to give Nye and his team a huge shout out and thanks for all their help. Super helpful for this project. So once we were able to do that, we cleaned the data, put it into the model, and that kind of helped us do everything we'll show you next. So step number 2, we did funding demand. So why is funding demand important? So funding demand essentially is just going to show you when assets theoretically reach the end of their life. And all we're looking through here is just like, is it short term, a lot of expenditures? Is it medium term? Is it long term? I like to kind of think like, is it a big wave, like a tsunami kind of right there? Is it kind of a mountain where it's flat and then up? Or is it kind of like a ramp? Does it slowly go up over time? And why is that important? Because it kind of determines your investment strategy. How fast do you need to kind of address these replacements, et cetera? If it's a big kind of wave short term, well, maybe you have less time to kind of figure it out. If it's more of a mountain in the middle, you have a little bit of time. And if it's more of a kind of a ramp, you have more time to figure it out. So that's all we're really looking for here. And so we'll go through this for each fund and category. So just a quick check here. So water capital fund has water assets, sewer capital fund has sewer assets, and general capital fund has things like roads, bridges, parks, fleet and equipment. So all those other assets that you as a community own, they're tucked under general fund. Water is funded through water rates, sewer is funded through sewer rates, and general capital is funded through taxation. So when we looked at the funding demand, and this is simply what we did is we looked over a 30-year horizon. So we didn't want to look out too far. We didn't want to look too narrow. So we picked 30 years as kind of a good window to look in. That's not too crazy into the future, but not too short term. And we added up all the expenditures and divided it by 30. And this is what the numbers came out to be. So on average, if you consider the data, it's about $892,000 per year on average in asset replacements coming up on total. In water, it's about 230. For sewer, it's about 40,000 per year. And general capital, it's 524,000 per year. And that's essentially if you replace assets at the end of their estimated life. That doesn't account for assets that have already passed their life, which we'll talk about in a second. And we're going to talk about some scenarios where we allow assets to actually go past their life. And so this just kind of gives you a high level sense if you were to replace these assets. So wouldn't look too much into this. We're going to actually dive into much deeper in a second. The next thing I just want to show, this is just a generic sample graph, but I just put it up here to orient ourselves. We're going to go through this for the 3 funds. But what you'll see in each of the following graphs, the black line is a 5-year rolling average of expenditures. The gray line, which you can see right there, is the average annual. So that's what we just looked at. And right here, you can tell what fund it's part of. So just keep this in mind as we look at the next graph. So this one, we're looking at all assets. This is all of Lions Bay. It's a 5-year rolling average. So you can see kind of the black line rolls up and down over time. And near the end, it's kind of generally trending upwards to the right direction. So what does that tell us? That asset replacement expenditures are slowly increasing over time. You can see the gray line, the average that we looked at before, is the 792. You can see it right there. So that's 792. Again, we just add up all the expenditures, divide it by 30, and that's essentially what it averaged out to. The water is a little bit more up and down there. So you can see, again, the average is 230, and you can see kind of the first couple of years. And I think one thing to note here, this doesn't account for assets that are already past their life. So there are assets already past their life, I think some PRVs, et cetera. But you can see it's kind of a little bit below the average for the first couple of years, not including the past life assets, which we'll talk about in a second. Then there's a little bit of a wave of expenditures kind of in the middle here, and it bumps up and down, and then it trends upward kind of near the end of the planning period, 20 to 30 years. So I think that's important to note. And for sewer, you can see it's kind of below the average for most of it. And then there's a spike or a wave, if you will, kind of medium term. I think some pipes are nearing the end of their life. So that tells you there's kind of a wave of expenditures coming down the line that if you plan today, that, you know, when that wave happens, it doesn't kind of come with a shock. So that's sewer fund. And now if we look at general fund, so this is like roads, fleet and equipment, et cetera, et cetera. You can see it kind of goes below the average, kind of the first 10 years, then bumps up and down, and it averages around 524,000. So, you know, I think kind of the wavy nature of the line, it tells you, you know, the importance of kind of leveraging debt and having reserves to manage these waves. And this information directly feeds into the next section. So I wouldn't take too much away from this. Just know, like, was there a big wave short term? Was it medium term? Was it long term? So notice that for each one. And I think for all of them, I would say the funding is kind of trending in the upward direction if you look at those. So those are my key takeaways. I wouldn't look too much into this one. I think the more important slides are coming next. So step number 3, what we looked at here was risk and level of service. So this is the most important element. I think this one and the next steps are really important one to keep a keen eye on. So what we did here, don't worry about the spinning graphics, is we said, how can you measure risk and level of service of your assets? And there is a ton of different ways to do that. You can get very technical. You can keep it high level. I really like using these set of metrics, or KPIs, key performance indicators. So the way I think about it is, just like your body, you have a set of vital signs that inform your health. Your heart rate, your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and all these things are vital signs that inform the overall health of your body. And essentially your assets have the same type of vital signs. And so those are these 3. So first, we look at the past life assets. You can see in the bottom right here, which is a measure of the percentage of assets past their estimated life. So for example, if you owned $100 in assets, $10 of them are past their life, 10% of your assets are essentially past their life. So that's kind of that measure. Then there's another one called consumption or consumption ratio, which is how far on average are you into the asset's lifespan. So say if you owned an asset that had a 100-year lifespan and you're 50 years into it, it would essentially be 50% consumed. And essentially you use these 2 metrics together to calculate your health score. And we can go into how to actually do that. But for example, if you are 0% consumed and 0% of the assets are past their life, so it's brand new, health score is 100%. As the assets pass their life and they get consumed, the health score will go down. So if you had 100% of your assets past their life, 100% consumed, your health score would be 0. So it's important to kind of consider these in conjunction. And these essentially will be the metrics we use to measure risk and level of service. And we'll share in a second why and how that is. But just keep these metrics in mind. And the reason I kind of like using this asset health score kind of approach is it really becomes a conversation paradigm shift, that instead of people always saying, hey, let's keep taxes low, I think a cool new term to say is, well, let's keep assets healthy. So it's kind of a little bit of a mindset shift while considering affordability, because as everyone knows, Affordability is super important for communities, but it's kind of instead of keep taxes low, it's like, let's keep asset healthy while considering affordability, because without healthy assets, the community essentially can't run and thrive. So I just want to give a quick analogy here to help you guys kind of understand risk and level of service. So I want you to picture a bucket of water, and you could imagine this bucket of water has some water in it, and you're putting water in at the top and water's leaving the bucket at a certain rate. So essentially, as you know, if you're not filling the bucket at the same rate that the water's leaving, eventually the bucket will get empty. And so think about that as rate of investment. So the amount of water you're putting in is the rate you're investing into asset replacement. And the rate that the assets are deteriorating is the rate at which water is leaving the bucket. Now, the consumption ratio, which we talked about, is how far down that bucket is. So if the bucket's kind of half the water is left, it's about, you could think 50% consumed. If all the water was gone, it'd be 100% consumed. And think about the past life assets are kind of like the water that we've estimated to leave the bucket, but is still in there because you're using kind of your best guess at, say, I think the water should leave at about this rate, but it's not exact. It's kind of it's an estimate, just like the service life on your assets. And the health score is really a combination of investment, how far that bucket's gone down, the rate it's leaving, and how much water that you're estimating should have been out, but it's not. So think about these buckets, and we're going to essentially think about each asset category and how full or empty do you want your bucket. So for example, if the bucket's completely full, that would be pretty low risk. You got a lot of time. The bucket's nice and full. It'd be it's a brand new asset, providing a high level of service. If the bucket's empty or closer to the bottom, there's a higher risk that as soon as that tap gets shut off, the bucket could be empty. And so there's different trade-offs there, which we'll talk about. But think about this bucket, keep it in your head as we're going through some of the results. So let's kind of bring it down into a little bit more realistic here. So if you think about the asset health score, I want to kind of talk about the correlation between health score, risk, and level of service. So the health score, the higher the health score, which means less assets are past their life, less assets are consumed. What does that mean? There's a lower risk of failure and a higher level of service. It's a newer asset. Now, the opposite's also true. As the health score drops, more assets are past their life, more the consumption ratio goes up, the risk of failure goes up, and the level of service goes down. So you could think about when the bucket's full, again, low risk of failure, high level of service. When the bucket's empty, there's a high risk of failure and a lower level of service. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's really up to you guys as community leaders, how full or empty you want those buckets. And there's kind of trade-offs on investment levels, which we'll get into. So we'll give an example just to kind of hammer this home. So if you think about, say, transportation or roads, say there's a health score of 82, 10% of the assets are past their life, meaning 10% of the value. So say you own $100 in transportation assets, $10 are past their life, that's 10%. 50% consumed, so it's about halfway through its life. Now, when we compare that to, say, a parks asset, which has a health score of 58, so the bucket level is a little bit lower, 30% of the assets are past their life instead of 10, but the consumption ratio is still the same, about half. You can see that the parks, because more assets are past their life, have a higher risk of failure and would be providing a lower level of service. So, that's the main difference right there. You can see 30% or 1/3 of the assets are past their life for parks, and about 10% are for transportation. Therefore, parks have a higher risk of failure, lower level of service. They're essentially a little bit older. And one last example, and I just kind of talk about this in a couple different areas because it's important, it builds on everything, is I think about these two cars. So you can think about the Toyota Corolla on the left-hand side. It's a fairly old car, so there's probably a lot of assets are past their life. It's fairly close to the end of its life. Maybe it's fairly consumed. So you could think about taking that car from, say, Lions Bay to Whistler. There's a higher risk that it could break down. It's a lower level service. You don't have air conditioning. There's no sunroof. There's no Bose stereo system, etc. So it's not as a nice of an experience, but it's still a great car. It's still reliable, and it'll still get you there. But there is those risks because it's a little older. And now you look at the car on the right, Honda, fairly reliable car. This one would have less assets past their life, probably 0. It looks like a brand new car. Less of the assets consumed. It's brand new. Health score is probably 100. Driving between, Lions Bay and Whistler, high likelihood you're going to get there. Low risk of breaking down. High level of service. You got nice new seats, air conditioning, sunroof, stereo system, etc. So those are just a couple examples of risk and level service, health scores, and that's essentially what we'll dive into now for your specific assets. So let's dive into Lions Bay. So essentially you guys own $47 million in infrastructure. So that would be the cost today if you're to replace all your assets, which would never have to happen. But I think it's a good number to know. I think it's a good number to build some awareness with community members saying, hey, we own an asset portfolio worth approximately 47 million. So I think it's a good awareness one. And I think it's good for you guys as council, as staff to say, hey, we're essentially on the board of directors for a business that's there for the greater good of community, and we're responsible for managing essentially $47 million in assets. So I think it's a pretty cool fact and something to be really proud of, and a lot of responsibility. And I think it's a cool one to highlight. And I think a lot of community members too, sometimes assets are very expensive and sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around the value of them, but there's a lot of assets and they add up pretty quick. So let's look into the specifics of Lions Bay, those vital signs we were talking about. So as it stands today with Lions Bay, the asset health score is 88%. So about 8% of your assets are past their life and about 51% consumed. So you could kind of imagine it's about halfway into its life, about 8% of your asset portfolio is past their life. You combine those two together, the health score is 88. So that's today. And what we'll do is we'll break that down by fund for you. So you can see here by fund, you can see the 47 million broken down by fund. 24 of that is in water, 2.2 is in sewer, 20 millions in general capital. So you can kind of see how that adds up. But you can see where the assets are past their life. So about 6% of the water assets are past their life. Sewer capital currently has none. And general capital has 11%, which totals the 80. Then you look at consumption ratio, 51 overall. Water's about 46, sewer's 32, general capital's 59. So general capital has the most assets consumed and the most assets past their life, which is why it has the lowest health score. And then next up, the one with the best health score is sewer, 0% past their life, 32% consumed, 98%. And water's kind of in the middle, about 6% past their life, 46% consumed, 90% health score. So that's really where you guys stand today. So I think, look around your community, you guys live there, you understand it, you kind of get a sense of what's going on and what these results could mean today. And this is only one aspect. So we know where we're at today. We're at a health score of 88. The question is, where do you guys want to go into the future? And that's what we're going to get into next. We can actually see different budgets and we can see how your health score and your vital signs change over time. And that's, I think, the really interesting thing about this approach. And today we kind of have an opportunity to put on some binoculars and look into the future and see the impact our decisions today could have on the future. So the question is to you guys is, what do you want your health score to be in the future? Do you want the bucket to be completely full? Do you want it to be half full? Where do you want it to be? And it might change by fund. So that's something we're going to dive into next. So in order to help you guys figure out how full or empty the bucket could or should be, what we did is we looked at what we call a service sustainability score. So service sustainability is really a measure to represent the overall quality of assets. We look at two things: impact, a risk, which is like if an asset were to fail, what's the impact of that risk, from a couple lenses: public safety, environment, finances, and reputation. Then we also looked at level of service, which is a measure that represents the relative quality of level of service, which looks at citizens' well-being and supporting the local economy. So this we'll dive into very quickly, but it will help inform how full or empty the bucket potentially should be. So what we did is we worked with staff in some workshops, and essentially we weighted the different kind of categories. So we looked at public safety. If an asset were to fail, what would be the impact on public safety? We looked at environment. If an asset were to fail, what's the impact on the environment? We looked at financials. If an asset were to fail, how would that impact the organization's finances? And if an asset were to fail, how would it impact the organization's reputation? So we rated those kind of 1 to 5, 5 being the most important, 1 being the least important. And I think it's important to know here, it's all relative. So they're all important. It's just like which one's more important than the other. So what we deemed in that workshop with staff, public safety was number 1, then financials next, then environment, then reputation. And kind of the consensus was if you take care of public safety, you take care of financial, and you take care of the environment, reputation will take care of itself. So that's some of the logic there. And we essentially assigned a score 1 to 5 for all your different asset categories. So I won't go into these specifically, but I'll draw your attention to the right-hand side of the screen there, the weighted score. So when we look at your assets from an impact of risk perspective, water came out to be the highest score at a 5, then sewer, then roads and bridges, then drainage, building, and equipment were tied next. So if you just take a pure risk lens, like impact if these assets were to fail, water was the most risky, then sewer, and then the other ones came below. So I think that's a cool lens to look at. Now the other lens is completely different, level of service. So you can think about, the quality that you're going to be getting from that. And we looked at that from the benefit. So really, how much do your citizens benefit from this service? What is the criticality? How critical is it to their well-being? Is it an essential service that they need to live their life? Is it semi-essential or is it non-essential? And we also looked at the impact these assets had on supporting the local economy. So again, we weighted them. Criticality came out the highest, well-being, then benefit to the citizens, and then economy was a little bit lower. And essentially we did that for each asset. Again, I won't go through these specific results. Draw your attention to the right. Water came out the highest from a level of service, but interesting enough, roads and bridges, when you take a level of service lens, tied water, which was different on the risk scenario. I think it was a little bit lower. And then buildings and equipment was ranked second highest. Whereas when you take a risk lens, I think it was ranked the lowest. And then sewer and drainage were next. So, I think it's important to just take away, there's two lenses, risk and level of service. And depending on the lens you take, the scoring will be different. So essentially we combine these together into what I call the sustainable service delivery score. So you can see if the level of service score was 1 and the risk was 1, it would get a score of 1. So very low importance level. If it got a level of service score of 5 and a risk of 5, so kind of like a water, it would get a service sustainability score of 25. And essentially that's kind of the philosophy here. And we'll get into why this is important in a second. So let's combine them together. We just use that matrix. And so water was a 5, level of service was a 5. So you can see the score when you weight it, because it's not exactly 5, it's like 4.78. And anyways, when you round it, it's around 23. So water came out to be the highest service sustainability score. Next was roads and bridges. So it kind of went into that high category. Next was sewer at a score of 12. So risk score of 4, level service score of 3. Drainage was a 10 and equipment was a 10. So what's really cool about this score now is it's kind of gives you guys a sense of priorities. So where does the funding need to go based on the service sustainability score? Well, the ones with the high probably deserve the most investment and attention. The one with the next, level score kind of deserves a less. And, at the end of the day, you guys don't have all the money in the world. So this gives you a lens of how do I prioritize? If I only have a limited amount of funding, where do I deploy this capital or this investment? So this is the correlation. So essentially the higher the service sustainability score, example, water had a 5 and a 5, the better the asset vital signs need to be, meaning the higher the health score you probably want, which means less assets are past their life, less is consumed, lower risk of failure, and a higher level of service. And the other opposite's true. The lower the service sustainability score, the lower the asset vital signs can be. So the less healthy assets can be, meaning more assets can pass their life, more can be consumed, which means higher risk of failure and a lower level of service. And that's okay because you've determined that these assets are still important, but less important relative to other categories. So again, this just gives you a systematic way to be able to allocate your asset replacement budgets. So that's risk and level of service. So at the end of the day, you kind of have 3 core metrics: health score, past life, and consumption ratio. We've looked at those scores today. And the next one we're going to look at is the impact different budgets have on those health scores, those vital signs, 30 years into your future. So I'll just pause here very quickly to see, do you guys have any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? Happy to answer any questions because I think it'll kind of feed into the next one. I've talked enough here for.
Corey. I don't see a board as to whose hands up or not. So for the counselors, if you've got a question, or just go with, just state your name and go for it.
Hey, Corey, it's Councillor Abbott, Neville Abbott here. Year one is 2021?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So just can you, how do we factor in recent asset improvements, or like the big capital spending we had on water in the last year and a bit? So how does, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is what would it have looked like last year, and how's that water one changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially, that's the beauty of this kind of system now. I think now that you have these vital signs set up every year, I think, you can, it's up to you guys, but if you update it every year, you can kind of report on the vital signs and see how they change. And I think it becomes a common language for you guys to report on. So say you get a grant or you do an investment, you say, hey, look at this grant or this investment. It changed our health score from a 88 to a 92, or less assets went down. So you can start kind of tracking and trending this over time. So we can't exactly do a like-to-like comparison because we don't have that from last year. But moving forward, if you do report on this, you'll be able to have that data. So I think that's a really interesting thing to mention. But how does it change? Basically, when your assets get replaced, they get updated in your financial records, essentially, and then that will update this. So they're all tied to when assets get replaced, they get updated in your inventory, and then all these results will be updated. So yeah, it's kind of dynamic in that sense. I don't know if that answered your question, but if any assets got replaced, it would have been accounted for. And there is a cutoff point in the model, which I think staff can talk a little bit deeper to. But does that answer your question, or is there anything deeper there?
Yeah, I think it does. I have one other question, I guess, and it maybe this one's more for Nye or for someone on staff. So when I look at the way you rank drainage versus roads, I struggle to sort of differentiate, because the drainage has a direct impact on the serviceability and the replacement of the roads. So Nye, I mean, how did you factor that in, or did you, when you were giving these scores? Or did you consider that? I mean,
So
I'm trying to see how you can't, but anyway, sorry.
yeah, so the asset management plan to date is based on current asset inventory, and the drainage assets are very poor. They're not fully accounted, and we need to spend and do more, spend more time and do more to improve the asset list within that category. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, we have looked at the drainage assets that are existing.
Okay. Okay, I guess it does, and I think now I'm remembering. I think we had this question before in a different form, and basically saying drainage is understated because it wasn't really fully sort of accounted for in the original assessment.
Correct.
Okay. But my other question was, so if drainage is a high risk, the failure to the drainage directly impacts the failure to the roads, because we know the one sort of impacts the other. So were you able to sort of have a sort of Chinese wall between the two, or did you factor in, you're considering the roads condition or the risk of the roads failure, the fact that it could be caused by the drainage? Did that kind of come into it in any way?
Yes, they're interrelated, and same with the expenditure. So as we expend money on roads, we will also be doing drainage as well.
Okay. I guess that kind of answers my questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for your question. Great questions. Anyone else have
I just
any
had a
questions?
yeah, I did have a quick question. Actually, I was just curious. I guess sort of I'm wondering what you would estimate staff time would be to maintain this once a month or once a year, whatever the period is. You're suggesting once a year we update, I guess, the background information or the data. And to spit out new reports and new projections? That's sort of the idea.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. So it's kind of up to you guys how often you want to report. Some people do it every year. Some people do it every couple of years. It's really up to kind of staff and you guys how often you want to be looking at this information. The cool thing about the inventory is it's really based on the financial information. So you actually have to update that inventory every year legally through legislation. So that inventory naturally will get updated, which is, I think, a really nice thing where I've seen others kind of try and build new inventories, and now you got kind of two things you're managing and it doesn't stay up to date. So it's based on that information so that the inventory data automatically will stay up to date, which I think is a huge positive, especially with, as you know, staff have a lot of work in a small community. So we want to make sure everything's as efficient as possible. And then you can take that data, plug it into the model and rerun it. I think some efficiencies, there's opportunities to build like a templated presentation, etc. The amount of time, I think it depends. It depends on kind of the familiarity with the model. I'm pretty familiar with it, so I can spin it up pretty, faster than probably someone new. But yeah, we could get an estimate. I don't have a complete understanding of that, honestly. It depends on someone, but it's not a ton of time. It's not a ton of time.
Like days worth of effort, kind of, or?
Yeah, like a day probably, like getting the data together, day in the model, then maybe a day preparing the presentation. So maybe like 2-ish days, and you could get the new data. But I think one thing to consider is getting like a templated presentation that allows to show you, 2020 was this, 21 was this, 23 was this, and you can start tracking. And you can imagine if your health score is constantly going down, maybe that's a leading indicator to say, hey, are we swimming in the right direction? So
cool, thank you.
So if I could jump in, I would expect that, we'll be updating our asset inventories and the condition of those assets on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis, as we do things and as we replace things. And I would think that the annual report would be one option as a logical place where annually we would report what's changed, how are we doing with our asset management plan, how are things, are we going improving, are we falling behind, what does that look like, and we can report on that as part of the annual report each summer.
awesome. Yeah, good question, and thanks for chiming in there, Peter. Any other questions before I move on to the most exciting part? Cool. Looks like oh, yeah.
Let's go.
Oh, let's go. All right. So I know this is the moment you guys all been waiting for. So step 4 is the forecasted asset replacement budget. So essentially why this is important. Well, different budgets, as you could imagine, have different impacts on these vital signs, on these health scores. So if you spend less, your assets will deteriorate and they'll be less healthy. And if you spend more, they'll be more healthy. And honestly, there's really no right or wrong answer. It's just like, what do you guys want for your community? And let's set it up that way. And I think that's the cool thing about this approach. You can kind of put on the binoculars, look into the future, and think about what do you guys want to happen. And that was, I think, kind of something missing in the past is it was kind of like one number and what does it really mean? So here we'll be able to actually see this, and I'll let you guys be the judge, but I think that's really a cool thing we'll go through today. So at the end of the day, like I said, the higher the asset vital signs, the more money you need to put into it. Just like, I don't know, you could think about you own a house, the more money you put into it, the more healthy it is, the more new it is, the more fresh, the more updated it is. The lower the vital signs, as things get old, you just can spend less money. And like I said, there's no right or wrong. There's probably a balance point there, but that's what we'll explore together today. So before we do that, I just want to bring this all together into one picture. So if we start on the right-hand side, and I know typically you probably go left to right, but let's go right to left. And you think about the asset data. So that's your inventory. We use that data to calculate the consumption ratio and the past life ratio. We combine those two to calculate your health score. And so we know the health score today, but now we're like, what do we want that health score to be? High, low, full or empty? Do you want that bucket? Then we use the service sustainability score, which is informed by the consequence of risk of failure, the level of service. So the higher the service sustainability score, the higher the asset health score, the lower the health score. And what does that do? Directly correlate to budget, because something that you want to have a higher health score should be more money should be spent on it, and something with less should have less spent on it. So this is the model. This is how it all ties together. And specifically, we'll dive into the green bucket next. So we looked at 4 scenarios here. So I'll go through each of these first. So scenario number 1, and this is all developed in conjunction with staff. The first one was status quo. So in this one, we said all funds are left. So this one is status quo. This is if you take all the funds you have after your operating expenses are accounted for, and we took a 5-year average, and you invested that into asset replacement, we looked at essentially what that impact would be. So you could imagine, say you make $100 a year as a salary, you have expenses, mortgage, you got to pay, you got to go get groceries. Say you're left with $2. Essentially, we assume that all the money that's left over would go into asset replacement. So that's what that scenario presents. Scenario 2, we said, once if we keep risk and level of service the same. So we know the health score today. Once if we say 30 years down the line, let's keep it kind of within that range as close as possible. How much money would we need on average per year to do that? Then scenario 3, we began to prioritize the budget based on the service sustainability score. So what we did is we said, and this is, I think, the unique thing. It's like, it's okay to let some assets go past their life. Why? Because they're service life estimates. They're not exact. We can't predict the future and say, this water pipe's going to last 68 and this one's 72 and this one 84. So there is a little bit of a element of estimation there. And although they've been ground truthed by NI and staff to the best of their ability, no one can predict the future, unfortunately. Whoever figures that out will do very well and help a lot of communities. And I'm sure it'll get there one day with big data, artificial intelligence, and all that great stuff. But in this scenario, we said for the high service sustainability score assets, let's allow 5 to 10% of them to actually go past their life. For the ones that are the medium, let's allow 15% of those assets to go past their life. And if they're low, let's allow 20% of the assets to go past their life. So you can kind of see how those service sustainability scores are going to come in. So that's scenario 3. And then scenario 4, we said, let's add another 5 to 10% of that. So for the high kind of service sustainability score assets, the important ones, let's allow 15 to 20% of the assets to go past their life. For the medium, let's allow 20. And for the low, let's go 25% past their life. So these are the scenarios that we model, and I'll show you the impact these budgets have on each of them. We'll look at the funding gaps associated, and we'll have some good discussion around it. So scenario 1. Oh yeah, no problem.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't really mean to interrupt. Something just came to mind there that I thought of but didn't ask. How do you deal with redundant assets? So we have infrastructure that is no longer required but is sitting there and it's just kind of rotting away, for lack of a better term. Is that included in the past life, or is it completely out of the view that we're looking at? Maybe Nye could explain how, you know what I'm talking about, Nye, old tanks that we don't intend to use anymore.
Yeah, they're not,
life, but we don't need them.
They're not part of the asset inventory. So they're not part of this calculation.
Okay. So there's 0 in assets, but we also haven't accounted for the fact that at some point we have to deal with them.
Correct.
Okay. So they are a possible cost liability, but they're completely outside of this analysis.
Yeah, most of those assets in terms of cost liability are public works time, and that's built into the budget. So It would be our time. There's no additional cost. It's not like significant water main where we have to go out to contract to remove them. They would be removed or demolished by staff.
Okay. Sorry about that, Corey.
Yeah, no worries. It was a solid question. Cool. I'll bring this back up here. Just bring this up. Sorry, just pulling this up. Okay. Bring this, put this into presentation mode. Share screen. There we go. What we can see right here, and we'll go here And there we go. So those are the scenarios. So let's look at scenario one. So scenario one, this is again assuming all funds that are left over after operating expenses are paid would go into asset replacement. It's around 199,000, 207,000. So just you can imagine every year all that money is just going into basically renewing of capital assets. So the next thing we're going to look at is what is the impact that budget has on your health score. And again, this is all assumed. This is all being used for asset replacement, which we know is not true. There's level of service increases. There's a bunch of other things besides like for like to consider. So what happens to your health score or your bucket, if you will, it kind of moves from 88% of the assets past their life, 8% past their life. And just a reminder there, 8% of assets that are past their life equates to around $3 million in assets past their life today. Consumption's 51%, and the health score is 88. Now, if we look 30 years into the future, essentially the health score will drop to 20%. About 46% of the assets will be past their life, and it's 112% consumed. So what you could kind of expect in here is an increased level of risk of failure, a lower level of service, and that's essentially under that current scenario. So what we'll look at is a different lens. So, well, it's the same lens, just a different way to think about it. So this is a graph. What you can see is the blue line is the health score. So you can see it kind of moves from 88% and it's slowly declining to 20% at the end of 30 years. You can see the consumption ratios going from 51% to 112. And you can see about 8% of the assets are past their life, all the way up to about 46% at the end of the period. So that gives you kind of a sense of the impact this budget would have on the future health of your assets. This is kind of a table view. I don't know if this is helpful, but you can see today, like I said, about $3.2 million in assets are past their life. In the future, 46% assets would be past their life, or about 21 million, with the annual budget of 199,000 into asset replacement. So, like I said, essentially, you'd expect risk to increase, lower level of service. The other thing too is in terms of this funding gap. So the current budget's 199. The forecasted budget in this scenario is the same as what you currently have available. So in this scenario, technically the funding gap's 0 because you've set the budget that way intentionally to see the impact. So that will change in the other scenarios. The funding gap will be bigger because we're going to be adjusting the forecasted budget above the status quo to see the impact. So that's scenario one. I'll go through the scenarios and I think we can kind of discuss and have some good discussion there. So scenario two, if you guys recall, we said, let's keep risk and level of service the same. What would that mean? And essentially we just looked at health scores around an 88 today. Once if it was an 88, 30 years in the future, what does that truly mean? So we look here and you invest on average about 840,000 per year into asset replacement. That's what that would mean. And when you look at the bucket today is 88, 8% assets are past their life, 51% consumed. Zoom 30 years into the future, your bucket's a little bit more full. It's 92%, basically the same. 5% of the assets are past their life, so a little bit lower, a little bit under 3 million, and about 70% of the assets are consumed. So like I said, what you could expect, generally speaking, is probably a similar risk, similar level of service in the community. So that's that one. Again, we look at kind of the same concept, but a different view. We're looking at the health score and the vital signs basically in a line graph rather than a bucket. And it's kind of flat, it's basically straight across. There's some up and downs here and there, but generally speaking, over this period, you could probably expect similar things today along that journey. So this is a table format. Again, you can see it broken down by total here. So 8%, 5% in the future. You can see the water fund, you can see the sewer fund, and you can see the general capital fund. So you can see kind of where those stand. But again, I think just keeping it higher level here, $840,000 per year gets you similar risk, similar level of service. And you can dive into this if you want specifically. But 90 today for water, 92 in the future. Sewer, 98 today, 98 in the future. General capital, 82 today, 84 in the future. Overall, 88 now, 92 in the future. So it's very similar. Now, when we look at the funding gap in this scenario, you can see the current budget is 199. The forecast is 840. So there's a funding gap of about $640,000 per year. That would be in this scenario if that was the target, if that was the goal for you guys. And so that's this scenario. And we'll next look at two other scenarios that look on taking a little bit more risk and lowering a level of service. And then, like I said, we'll circle back and generate some discussion. So scenario number 3, what did we look at? We said, let's prioritize the forecasted budget based on the service sustainability score. So again, what did we do? We said any assets with a high service sustainability score, let's allow 10 to 15% of those assets to go past their life. For the ones that have a medium, let's allow 20% of those assets to go past their life. And those who have a low, let's allow to go 25. And so that came out on average about 703,000 and change per year. And this is essentially what happens to your bucket in 30 years. It moves from an 88 health score, 8% past their life, about 3 million, 51% consumed, drops to 76. The number of assets past their life moves from 8 to 14. So it almost doubles, a little bit under. And the consumption ratio moves from 51% to 80%. So what you could, probably expect here, a little bit increased level of service, a little bit reduced level of service, but overall, 88, 76, you're kind of in that range. So that's scenario 3. Again, let's look at the same concept, just in a line graph. 88 today, you can see it kind of drops a little bit in year 20. There's obviously some expenditures coming up there that drops it down to 76. And you can see the past life assets kind of go from 8% past their life, and it slowly increases over time, and it gets to 14% at the end of the planning period. Again, this is just a table view. It's just all different lenses of this. If you want, you can dive into this, but I think the main thing is the health score is dropping, more assets are going past their life. For example, sewers, 0% today, 20% of the assets are past their life in the future. Sewer or water, 6% past their life today, 10% in the future. And general capital has a bunch of assets under there, which aren't shown. We're just keeping it at a higher level, but it goes up from 11% to 17% past their life, or health score drops from 82 to 64. So you can see that impact. Again, the funding gap here is a little bit lower. Current budget's 199, forecast it's 780. The difference, or the funding gap, is 581,000. So scenario 4 is the next one. So what we did is we added 5 to 10% to kind of those, the amount of assets that we allow go past their life. So in this one, again, prioritized based on the service sustainability score, but for assets in that high category, we allow 15 to 20% of the assets to go past their life. In the medium, 25% of the assets to go past their life. And for the low ones, we allow 30%. And that drops your budget essentially to 625,000 per year in asset replacement. So when we look at the impact on your health score, or your bucket, if you will, it'll move from an 88 down to a 64. What does that truly mean? Well, you move from 8% of your assets past their life, so about $3 million, to 20% of your assets past their life. 51% of the assets are consumed, and now you're at 85%. So what you could expect, again, a little bit more increase in risk level and lower level of service than, say, scenario 3, because it was a little bit higher, had a health score of 76. But that's really the impact. And when you think about the number of assets past their life, rough math, $47 million in assets, 10% is 4.7, times that by 2, that's like, 9 point something million dollars past their life. So that's for this scenario. Again, same concept, different lens. You can see the health score just slowly kind of dropping down to 64. Not much is happening over the kind of, first 20 years. It's slowly declining, but in the last 20, you can see it decline more. Why? Because there's a wave of expenditures coming out. It's slowly increasing. So you can see that gradually going down. And you can see the same thing with the amount of percent of assets past their life, 8% today, slowly ramping up to about 19 in the future. Again, just breaking it down by fund. If you guys wanted to take a look at this, health score is 88 today, 64 in the future. For water, 90 today, 64 in the future. Sewer capital, 98 today, 58 in the future. General capitals, 82, 55 in the future. And you can see all the assets past their life. Water's 15%, sewer's 25% past their life, general's 22, Why? Because some assets within that fund are 30%, some are 20, some are 25. So the key thing here is the funding gap again is slowly dropping. So current budget 199, forecasted budget 625, funding gap for 25. So I'll do a quick summary, bring it all together, and then love to kind of open it for questions. So overall, the one thing I just want to bring up is I think communities and local governments across Canada have been doing a great job at planning for O&M. The thing that most local governments across Canada haven't been doing is planning for the eventual replacement of their assets. So that's every community across Canada, in fact, across the world. Every local government's in the same boat, essentially. And they're all trying to work to solve this challenge. So you're not alone. It's a very common thing. I'm sure you've been to UBCM, all the conferences. This is a huge topic. And it's really gained momentum. It's now reached FCM, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and they have initiatives to support this work. So, but that's essentially what has happened. Communities have really planned for O&M really well, but they haven't fully financially planned for the replacement of assets. The unique thing, I think, for Lions Bay and communities in BC and Canada is we're a fairly young country, province, city. So if we plan properly today, there's a huge opportunity to set your community up for success in the future. We also learned about the asset vital signs and how you measure them and how they give you insights into risk and level of service. We also learned that you're responsible for managing $47 million in assets, which is, I think, a pretty cool responsibility. Approximately 8% of the assets are past their life. And I just want to kind of share with you what I've found on average, communities in BC that I've worked with. On average, I see kind of 10 to 30% of assets past their life, typical. About 51% of your assets are consumed, we conclude it. For BC, on average, 40 to 65 that I've seen. And the health score for you is 88. And I've seen it kind of go from 75 to 90. Just to give you some context of where you stand, I'd say you're right in the middle of the pack. Like I said, you're not alone. Every community is kind of in a similar situation. I think the difference is how communities plan moving forward. I think that's really will be the differentiator. Communities that don't address this will end up in a certain situation in the future, probably lower level service, higher risk, etc., and have a higher financial burden on taxpayers in the future. Those who think ahead will kind of set their community up for a little bit healthier infrastructure, less of a tax burden in the future, and kind of can keep rates more stable and consistent. So in summary, the scenario one, we said status quo, 199, let's keep that going. Scenario two, we said, let's keep risk and level of service the same. That was 840,000 per year. Scenario three, we allowed some assets to go past their life, prioritized based on the service sustainability score, 700,000. And then we took on a little more risk by allowing more assets to go past their life, and we were able to drop it to 625. So you can really see how, as you let more assets go past their life, in essence, you're taking on more risk of that asset failing. You can see how your budget drops. And as I mentioned, at the end of the day, we don't know exactly how long every asset's last. So it's okay to allow some assets to go past their life to a certain extent. But there's probably a point where it gets, not healthy. I would say in the future, when you can predict when every single asset can fail, which I'm sure we'll get to one day with all technology and all this, then you'd want 0% of your assets past their life. But we're not there today. We're using our best estimates. And that's why it's okay to allow some assets to go past their life. But the question, you guys, is to kind of what level. One thing I just wanted to bring in, just to give you context, the life cycle funding target, which essentially just says an asset is $10, say it lasts 10 years, so 10 divided by 10, it would say put $1 away every year. It's kind of, I'd say, the traditional way of thinking about this. Why I'm not a huge fan of life cycle is it doesn't account for how old the asset is, number one. Number two, it doesn't account for risk or level of service levels at all. And it's usually based on service lives that are very conservative. So it goes to that kind of estimate that I think is kind of a little overestimate, honestly. I think life cycle will be amazing when we can predict exactly when every single asset fails, but today we're not there. And that number, just for context, I don't want to focus on it too much, is 1.15 million. So when you actually take your assets and the service lives and account for all that, it's about 1.15 million. So it's pretty cool. Through looking at risk and level of service, we've essentially been able to present a couple scenarios that are below the life cycle, 800, 700, and 600 up for discussion. So just want to bring that up. Again, summary on the buckets. The first scenario, 20%. So this is in 30 years, your bucket goes down. 46% of the assets pass their life, 111% consumed. Scenario 2, risk and level of service the same. So you're around the same position, 5% pass their life, 71% consumed, 92 health score. Then we drop the health score a bit to 76 from an 88. 14% assets pass their life, 80% consumed. And then the last scenario is a 64%. So about 20% pass their life, 85% consumed. Again, funding gap, 0% in scenario 1, 640 in scenario 2, 503 in scenario 3, and 425 in scenario 4. So that's that one. I won't focus on this one too much. It's a lot of numbers. It just summarizes everything. And I think the key takeaway is probably this bottom portion of the graph. You can see how the health score and the past life changes. It's a nice kind of one pager to study and fall asleep tonight, reading or whatever you want. But the main thing here is scenario 1, you'd see the biggest increase in risk and the biggest drop in level of service. So that's under the current situation. And that's because the health score is dropping the most. This one, scenario 2, it's about the same. You can see similar. Scenario 3, you'll see less of a increase in risk and less of a drop in level of service, scenario 3. And scenario 4, you'll see a little bit more, a little bit less than scenario 3, but less than scenario 1. So this is kind of a summary. We won't go through every number. Feel free to read it on your own time. But in summary, before we go to questions, I think you guys have done a great job really at maintaining infrastructure to date. You guys have a dedicated infrastructure levy and have planned for contributions moving forward. I think that's huge. That's like a huge milestone. Like, pat yourself on the back for thinking that way and getting that forward. I think there's a lot of foresight there. But there is really an opportunity, I think, today to plan for the future, to promote stable and consistent tax increases so that when these assets come up, you have the funds to replace. And at the end of the day, if you plan for the future, it can be little increases today, can have huge impacts on your future. And, it took communities many years to get into these situations across Canada, and it will take, many years to get out of it. But if today you start thinking about it, I think you can really set your community up for success. So the thing I would leave you thinking about, or the ask of today, if I can ask you guys of one thing, is take time to reflect. Think about these buckets, think about your health score, think about your community, think about what the people want, think about what you'd want for your community if you were living in it. And what is that desired future state? How full or empty do you want that bucket? What's the impact of that budget financially? And just think about it and take it into consideration into budgets, into future decisions, etc. So that's kind of it. We'll go quickly into next steps for consideration, then we'll ask questions. So the next steps for consideration for you guys, take the lessons from this project, I think integrate it into budget discussions, the long-term financial plan. I think once you determine what that funding target is ideally for you guys, I think begin building a financial strategy to bridge that gap from the current level. And an opportunity, as Nye mentioned, I think is improving the inventory. So you can improve the building inventory, you can improve the storm inventory potentially. And there's different ways to think about that inventory, which we won't get into today. But anyways, I'll open it to questions. That was a lot of information. I know you guys have a lot of questions and I'm here to answer them for you.
Ron, can I ask a question or not?
Corey, can we go to the gallery, please?
Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Tony Greville. I'm on the infrastructure committee, but
And Tony will be waiting until public participation here.
oh, sorry. Okay, beg your pardon.
Thank you. Hang on. Carla, can you do the gallery view, please? Thank you very much. So to the council members, if we've got some questions, let's nip through it, and then we'll go to the, I don't mind doing a bit of a hybrid and having the public participation melding into this. So councillors first up. No hands up.
I've got a quick, more of a question, but so we have our levy that we have put in place. What percent, so ideally what we're looking at is $1,500 per household a year increase to reach that $840,000 annual threshold, which would be ideal. We're putting away a certain amount so far. Pam, can you tell us what, I don't know if this is, if you can answer this right now, but from what we have as an infrastructure levy placed on households so far, how much more would we need to apply to each home to reach that $1,600 annual to hit that $840,000 a year?
So I haven't calculated that yet, but that's exactly what I want to discuss when we're doing the budget, looking at the different scenarios, because obviously it's something we can't go from, you know, A to Z in one fell swoop. As we're doing the budget, we'll see, the first thing we'll calculate is that 199 was an average. And unfortunately, last year it was technically zero. Because if you remember, we've pretty much funded all of our capital from draws from reserves and from surplus. So we'll start by seeing what the number is this year and basically take it from there. So to me, this is like a great leaping off point to do the budget this year, to determine, you know, if we want to look at increasing the infrastructure levy, what the tax rate should be, prioritizing the assets, because I see it as sort of a goal to achieve whatever level council wants, but we would never be able to do that in 1 year.
Yeah, no, thank you. Not just in 1 year, just out of curious how that would actually look. And then I guess I'm just thinking of creative ways other than just taxing the residents for this. We definitely need to look at other things, but thank you, Corey, so much for your presentation. That was very, very helpful.
Jamie, it's wrong. Your math is correct. I've got it on my sheet because I came to the same conclusion. You know, depending on how many parcels you want, whether developed or undeveloped, all of them, some of them, and taking the BC assessment out, just doing a flat number. So I think your math is fine on that one. So if you kind of hold that in your mind for the gold standard.
Yeah.
That's where it is. So we'll go with Councillor Barmere and then Councillor Abbott.
Yeah, thanks again, Corey. It was very easy to follow presentation. I appreciate that, and I wonder if you can make some recommendations on how to publish that in a synopsis that we could distribute. And do you have any experience doing that? Something that's easy to follow, maybe a one pager. You know, residents don't lose interest if it's 20 pages or however many slides you have there. I think that might be hard to digest, right? And be nice to have, or at least recommendation from you on how to present that in a way that people can follow and understand sort of the position we're in and why we may or may not be looking to fund that in whatever way. And sort of second, I wonder, do you get municipalities asking for ways to generate revenue? Do you have recommendations for ways for revenue generation that you see other smaller municipalities doing that maybe face the same revenue gap that we have?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, yeah, communicating this to the residents is very important. You know, if you bring them along and you show them the information, what I've found from past experiences, people generally get on board because they can see the information, they can see what you're trying to do. And so I really like where your head's at there. So yeah, done a ton of that. And I think it's a super important piece that sometimes people don't do. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts around that and some thoughts I can share. In terms of generating revenue, I like where your head's at. So there's a couple different ways. I think Lake Country was a really cool community who actually, they built a turbine. They built this pipeline and they put a turbine in the middle of it and they actually generated electricity and sold it back to the grid. And I think they made like $500,000. I don't know the exact number, but there was some money. So that was kind of interesting. It's like, okay, well, that's an out of the box idea. So that's one. Another one too you can consider, but it's hard in a small community, is, you know, some communities get rid of assets. Like, do we really need that community center with that big pool? We got an amazing lake to jump in or an ocean. Do we need that? And so that's another way to think about it, but it's so hard in a smaller community. You guys are already mean, like from a staffing perspective, from an asset perspective, but that's, you know, kind of one other way to think about it. So those are the two that come to mind. Solar panels and Santa selling that energy back, that kind of becomes a theme. But honestly, I haven't seen anything super great. And I think that's a great opportunity for improvement, is like, instead of just taxes, instead of just grants, what are another revenue opportunities for communities? And so I think that's a great question. And it's a great thing to explore. And I honestly, personally haven't seen anything too, you know, mind blowing about it. except that one I read about and I was pretty impressed with overall.
There you go. Thank you very much, Councillor Abbott.
I think, Corey, my question's actually for Pam again. I was going to ask, I think, the same question that Jamie asked, but I'm going to ask it a different way because I'm not sure I understood the answer. So what I was trying to understand, Pam, is, so what's the basis for the 199K? So I gather it assumes, we don't spend anything out of our existing reserves, but does it assume we spend the current infrastructure levy fully in a year?
No, we didn't include the infrastructure levy because I think the plan with that is we were starting to bridge our funding gap. So we didn't want to tax it one year and spend it the next. It was an attempt to try and build our reserves. So that wasn't calculated in that number. It was essentially taking our revenue less our expenses for the year, mostly operating expenses, and then seeing what was left over. So if you think of when I do the budget process, we go through the base budget and then we find out, and that included a tax rate, it was 3% the last couple of years, what was left over basically to spend on capital. So the exceptions were things like there was some capital that was fully funded by grants or draws from reserves. So it wasn't that, it's just sort of that extra capital we need. So the reason, I think Corey highlighted this, it's probably a little aggressive to count the whole 199 because there's things we have to spend with that money that just aren't putting it aside for replacement of capital. So we racked our minds to find the best way to kind of get an estimate. We did the 5-year average, but it really goes up and down every year. Like for example, last year, there was really no money left over. That's why everything that we did in capital, we were planning to draw from surplus to pay for it. So it was just really to just kind of, it's something very fluid. It's not exact. It's kind of the average, just to give you a sense of the different scenarios. And that's what I tried to draw in with Jamie, that the number that will really matter is when we do the budget this year, how much money is left over. And then we'll look at different things we want to start doing. Do we want to start partially budgeting for depreciation, like recognizing we now have to start putting, more money aside than we have been putting aside. The infrastructure levy wasn't included in that number. So you could reduce it by the amount that we're currently taxing for the infrastructure levy, which I believe is about 140,000 a year.
So to look at it another way, and I understand all the reasons that you just said why we wouldn't do this, but if we assume that all things were equal and that was an exact science and that number was 199, and we decided to spend everything we tax for the infrastructure levy, in theory, we could have 350,000. I understand there's a risk on our financial side that we're not sort of increasing our reserves, but in theory, we could potentially spend 350 and all things could still be equal, correct?
Yes.
Yes, but another thing we have to look at is another key point is that number of expired assets. So to me, there's like a ticking time bomb. At any time, those assets could go. And a lot of those assets are roads. So I think at a minimum, we have to look at having enough in reserves to cover our expired assets. And that's at a minimum, because we also need to draw on reserves for other things. So, I mean, like I say, I think we finally have some really useful information to help us, next month when we look at the budget. And I'm quite excited about it because it's always been like a nebulous number. How much should you have in reserves? How much should you put aside for infrastructure? And now we have something that I look as a guideline to guide us.
And we also have the asset sales too, that we can borrow from ourselves. It's a roundabout way of doing it too.
Yeah, I mean, asset sales, grants, all of that kind of changes it on a year-to-year basis dramatically.
It does. And that, and then that's again, what is so exciting about this tool is, as Corey had said, a lot of times this is done completely separate from the financial statements and it tends to be put on a shelf and then you never get around to updating it. This is linked directly with our TCA, which I have to update every year for the audit. So that's the time that we talked about, even with the annual report, it will definitely be updated every year. And as we get more information, because it's Public Works who's doing this for us and not consultants, when public works are out just doing their day-to-day job, and then they come across an asset, no, this is in worse shape than we thought. Unfortunately, it's usually that way. Then we can feed that into the model. And so we'll always have this fluid information. But you're right, if we suddenly, like we're waiting to hear from a grant for the Upper Bayview DWIP project, we'll hopefully hear in February. If we get that grant, then we slot those numbers into the plan, and it has an amazing impact because we suddenly have $2 million we can throw into a plan, and we have a brand new asset.
Yeah, and another thing I'll just add to, I think there's kind of two aspects to think about here. So I'll just kind of draw your attention to this slide. Oops, so what I'll do is I'll bring that up. And so there's kind of two aspects. There's this idea of putting away money every year into asset replacement, which you could think about kind of like putting a little bit money every way into a bank, like in your personal life, you're putting it away for savings. And then there's a certain amount in your bank account, as you know, personally, you like to kind of have as a safety net. You know, I think in some instances, people think 3 to 6 months living expenses they want to keep in there for emergencies. And then people have different strategies. So what's interesting about this is there's two things for you guys to consider. How much do you annually want to put into the reserve, i.e. the infrastructure levy? But then how much do you want that reserve to be? And I think looking at these scenarios, you can kind of use those as proxies to determine what that level is. So for example, do you guys want to be the lower risk level? You know, maybe you want to have, if your assets are at, maybe you determine this scenario, maybe you're like scenario 3, we really like it. Well, there's a certain amount of money that you need to put away each year. I think it was, 600 or 730,000 every year. But then you might want to keep a minimum amount in the reserve to help protect your downside. So essentially we're allowing 14% of the assets to go past their life, which is a risk, which means they could fail. But maybe your theory is like, if you want to be really risk adverse, let's keep all that money. So the 14%, whatever it is, 6-7 million in a reserve. So if those assets do fail, boom, we can deploy the capital and we can replace that asset. That would probably be the most risk adverse one. Maybe you're like, let's keep half of it. Let's keep 7% of it in a reserve. So maybe it's for 3 or 5 million, whatever that is. And so there's kind of two aspects. There's how much to put away and what level do you want that reserve? And I think now you have the data to at least have a really informed discussion on what should that level be. And it's just something to consider as you're going through this also.
There you go. Councillors, any more questions? I'm ready to go to the residents in a minute. So Tony, get ready. Councillors, go ahead before I go to the residents. Thank you. All right, I tell you what, we're going to break with protocol here. There's 5 residents online. So I think we'll just call this public participation at this time. So I know that Mr. Grebel's got a question. Why don't we start with you? And I think for other residents, once Mr. Grebel's finished, if you want to unmute yourself, I see one is, but some aren't. But I need a signal that you'd like to go. So just would residents put their hands up, Carla, or no? So if you're a resident and you want to be on the queue for the questions, Tony, you're going to go first. Please put your hand up on your participation piece. So Mr. Grebel, you have the stage.
Okay, got a couple of questions. Want to make sure I understand what I'm reading there. I'm pretty sure I do. Under scenario 4, that looks to me to be an irresponsible way to go, because in 30 years' time, we're going to end up, tell me if I'm correct, with 20% of the assets past their life and then everything else at 80% of their life, which means while we may get to 30 years in good shape, 35 or 40, there's a huge time bomb. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's a good question. So yes, 19%, you are correct. At the end of the period would be past their life. So if you turn that to a dollar figure, like I said, 10% of 47 million, 4.7, double it. It's about $8 or $9 million in assets that could potentially fail. So I think that's an important thing to bring up. And they're 80% consumed, to your point. I mean, they're almost at the end of their life. So there is a shorter, you can imagine that bucket of water, it's getting pretty low. And so if that tap turns off, it could be empty fairly quick. So it's just something to consider in the scenarios. But
so that would be irresponsible, I think. Another question is your numbers there, that's 840 grand a year to maintain the status quo. That would be just maintaining or replacing current infrastructure assets. there's no allowance in there for improving the infrastructure assets, i.e. filtration plant. That would all come on top, correct?
Yeah, very correct. So this was just like for like replacement, keeping the things they are. It's no level of service increases. It's no regulatory. If new regulations come in and say you need to do this, it doesn't account for that. It's like for like replacement. So yes, correct.
Okay, and then one last other thing, maybe for Pam and I. I think I agree with Neville and maybe Norm that the risk associated with drainage failure might have been underestimated. And I guess if you want to do a review for the annual report, there are options to increase the consequence of the risk and maybe move that further up the pecking order. Is that correct too? And maybe that's Nye and Pam and Peter to do for next summer.
Yeah, as Neville said, the drainage is underestimated and under totaled in this model, in this scenario. And it's our job over time to improve on that.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thanks for participating. To the other residents, there's still 4 of you. I don't see a hand. I'll move back to council unless one of you, I see somebody over there.
Oh,
Mr. Sretsky, did you want to participate? Unmute and please ask your question.
Thank you. First of all, comment to presentation, I must say, disappointing. 70% of information is generic at high school level and unrelated to Lions Bay. Fundraising demand interpretation was most of the time incorrect. I don't know how you read quickly the information, but when you have a keen eye on it, it's quite inaccurate. Asset assessment, nearly the same. The risk assessment appears to be virtually personal opinion of individual or two individuals. It's not an assessment of any measure. I would like to see how that arrive. And I would like to make a comment to a council. We have a second year of national financial crisis here. If you haven't raised it, since Second World War, nothing happened like that to Canada. So I suggest this is not a year to increase the budget for the municipality. Even Greater Vancouver stated that they will be lowering it in case of situation that we have. So I think we can cool off on trying to increase the savings for the future expenditures and things like that. This is not a time, really. Ask yourself where we stand, please.
Do you have a question for the presenter, Mr. Sretsky?
No, I find that the presentation of very little value.
Thank you very much, sir. To our other residents, are there any questions? I will go back to Corey to close. There being none, can you make them? Back to you, Corey, if you want to do a closing piece, and then council can ask any last questions.
Awesome. No, just want to thank everyone for asking great questions. Number one, listening. I know it's a lot of information to take in, and just want to give a huge thank you to staff and everyone involved. Everyone is very passionate, helpful, and engaged, which I deeply appreciate. This is something near and dear to my heart, and I love working with people who are also passionate about it. And so, yeah, thanks so much for coming today, asking questions, for all the help and support, and hope you found this really helpful. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'm here to help out.
Just hang on then. Before I'll blend the public participation piece here. There, again, still 5 members of the public on. If you got any last questions for the presenter, this is your time to ask now. Just put your hand up. Otherwise, we'll say goodnight to him and then we'll conclude. There being none, thank you very much for your presentation, Corey.
Cool. See you guys. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Corey.
Thank you. And to our gallery, the 5 individuals from the residents, I'm fine if somebody wants to make a point or a statement on anything that you choose to that's on the agenda. please do so now. Just unmute, and you've got a minute or two if you'd like. There being none, we'll move on, and that will conclude the public participation, which would be the next item will be item number 5 on our agenda, which is the review and approval of minutes of the prior meetings. And the first one is the Council Strategy Committee meeting of December 1st and 2nd, which is on your package, page 3. I will put forward the motion. I'll look for a seconder, and if there's any amendments, please do. The Council Strategy Committee meeting minutes of December 1st and 2nd, 2020 be approved as circulated. I'll put that forward. Can I have a hand from a councillor? Thank you. Any changes, omissions, additions from the council members? Councillor Bain. Oh, yes, Councillor Abbott. You're muted, Councillor Abbott.
I was going to say Fred put his hand up first. He can go first.
One more time, Councillor Abbott. What was the
I
question?
thought Fred put his hand up. I was going to ask him if he wants to go first.
No, I wasn't looking at speaking. I was just seconding.
Okay.
He's become a technocrat. Yeah.
So there were a few changes that were brought up in the last meeting, and I actually got my old notes, and now I've realized that some of them were actually done already. So just give me a second. I'm just flicking by the ones that have already been corrected. I assume that was Carla. Thanks, Carla. Okay, so if we go to page 6 is where I stopped last time. On the item on page 6, top of page 6 of 18, sorry, this is page 8 of 20 of the agenda package, 6 of 18 of the minutes. That item on the Lions Bay Avenue Connector project, I thought both myself and Fred actually voted not in favor of that, and it was actually passed as 3-2. It says it was carried, which normally means it was carried by everyone. I thought Fred and I opposed it.
Would you like, both of you like to be recorded?
I think we agreed that we always record how people vote.
And Carla, please make the change. Thank you. Another one, Councillor Abbott.
Sorry, 1 second. As I said, I had all these notes from the previous one. That's all I've got on the first day. And if we go to the second day, on page 14 of 18 of the minutes, or 16 of 20 of the agenda package, the comments credited to me, item A, B, and C. Item C, good maintenance practice. I didn't go listen to the audio, I'll be honest, but I'm pretty sure I was talking about road and stormwater drainage here. And that was the idea that we should start doing some stormwater drainage work as part of a maintenance program. And I'm 90% sure that's what I said. It was definitely what I meant. So could we add good maintenance practice for road and stormwater drainage?
Carla, you got the change? It's changed.
Okay. A couple of typos, I think, on the correspondence. I think R16 is P. McLaughlin. I might be wrong. Not McLaughlin. Maybe I'm wrong on that. And then on public questions, number B, we've got a Mr. R. O'Dwyer and then R. McGuire. I'm actually not sure which one it is, but
I think you're correct. I think it's not Dwyer.
It is. It's Ron O'Dwyer.
okay,
It
so
is?
McGuire should be O'Dwyer then.
Correct.
Good pickup, Neville.
All right, that's all I've got.
Thank you very
The
much.
rest of them were fairly high, but fair reflection of the discussion. So thanks, Colin.
Thank you very much, Carla. You've got those. Thank you. Council members, any other changes, amendments, additions? There being none, no hands up. All in favor, ayes. As amended, nays opposed. Carried, thank you.
Right.
All right, and so that is the 2 sets of minutes. Thank you, Carla and Peter, for those. Business arising from the minutes. I'll start with the council members first. If you've got any business arising or Ellen? I think if there is none from the council side, I would ask that one of the, and this isn't unfinished business because I don't believe it's been started yet, if the CAO is contemplating business licenses, could he please bring that back to council on a verbal basis for what his thinking is? I think we'd like to have the chat about that before we ask you to continue on. And I guess the other piece that I took away, and this was from Resident Shore, and it was a reference of multiple ways of feedback. And if that could come back to council, how we communicate with our residents in the village. I know we're doing what we do, but I don't know that we're exploring any other ideas. I think that was one of Councillor Barmier's longer standing points as well too. And all that was said from our presenter, I see that the PRVs seem to have the highest priority pretty much. Works manager, is that true? In terms of following the infrastructure master plan?
Yes, because they're past their life.
Yeah, so you're looking at 2 as a minimum, 3 would be best.
I had planned on talking about this at the budget presentation, but it's my belief and staff's belief that some of the water main work is of more priority.
I look forward to that presentation because I was going to ask you to do not less than 2.
Sounds good. You'll see it.
Thank you. Sorry, so I'll just leave it at that. Council members, any other pieces of unfinished business? There being none, new business. I don't believe it's not carded, so we're done on that. Back to the public for the close before we go in camera. To Mr. Shore, Mr. Sredsky, I think you're still here. You've got the floor, either of you, if you'd like a minute. If not, we're going to say goodnight.
Thanks very much, guys. Good night.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shore. Mr. Sredsky, we'll say goodnight to you. That'll be the conclusion of public questions and comments. We'll now go to the closed council meeting. The proposed topics for discussion in the absence of the public are the minutes from December 1st and 2nd, 2020. CIO, were there any additions?
I don't think so.
None. Council members, anything? I'm looking at nothing. Good, thank you. That the meeting be closed to the public on the basis of matters to be considered under the following sections of the community charter, section 91. A, C, J, K, and N. Council does not anticipate reconvening the open meeting for any purpose other than to adjourn the meeting generally. Can I have a motion that would be acceptable to go into in camera? Councillor Abbott, can I see a hand? Thank you. A second? All right, we'll say goodnight to the public and we will go into in camera. And
Before we switch, was there a new link set out?
Carla?
No, we can just stay on. And
Just stay on and we'll say goodbye to Mr. Sredsky.
Okay.
All right, Merrick, I'd like you to sign off. Thank you. Okay. All right, let's do the face count. I think we're all there. There's nobody hiding on the sides, is it, Carla?